I'm Laura Lucas Magnuson, and this is The World Unpacked.
Turn first to the White House South Lawn and the signing of the first Arab-Israeli agreement in a quarter century as Israel normalized relations with Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates.
To all of Israel's friends in the Middle East, those who are with us today and those who will join us tomorrow, I say, Assalamu alaikum. Peace unto thee.
Today is a truly historic occasion, a moment of hope and opportunity for all the peoples of the Middle East.
After decades of division and conflict, we mark the dawn of a new Middle East.
The Israeli army says it has struck Hamas targets in the Gaza Strip early on Wednesday. The bombings are an apparent retaliation for rockets fired from the Hamas-controlled territory the previous evening. Now, the rockets were launched as Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain signed accords in Washington to normalize diplomatic relations.
We consider it very deep stabbing in the back of the Palestinians. It is a free offer for the Israelis to continue their occupation.
Today, we're talking about how the recent Abraham Accords are likely to shift the trajectory of the Middle East. Joining us is Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment and a veteran negotiator. Thanks for joining us, Aaron.
Always a pleasure, Laura.
In recent weeks, Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates have normalized relations with Israel, with reports indicating that several other countries might be considering following suit. For our listeners, what does this actually mean in terms of concrete changes between the countries? And moreover, why was this news such an earthquake?
Well, from a technical point of view, the Abraham Accords are actually three. A general document signed by the president as a witness and the foreign ministers of Bahrain and the UAE, and Benjamin Netanyahu. A general statement of principles stressing tolerance, the importance of peace. And then there are two discrete, rather lengthy documents. The first, a treaty of peace, diplomatic relations, and full normalization of relations between the UAE and Israel. That's pretty comprehensive. It lays out cooperation in any number of areas, from investment to tourism to direct flights, security, telecommunications, energy, and the environment. And since Bahrain was late to the party, largely as a result of the Saudis giving the Bahrainis permission, there is a third document called a Declaration of Peace and Cooperation and Constructive Diplomatic and Friendly Relations. That's, again, President Trump as a witness, Foreign Minister of Bahrain, and the Prime Minister of Israel. So those are the technical aspects, but I really believe it's the politics here. It's the notion that somehow the traditional paradigm of how to pursue Middle East peace, most experts, including myself, I might add, and previous administrations have all assumed, apparently wrongly, that you would need major progress between Israelis and Palestinians in order to court the Arabs, entice them into an accommodation with Israel. This essentially breaks apart the conventional wisdom. You have two Gulf states that have been in contact with Israel for years, informal, under the table, some public, basically normalizing relations. And when I say normalizing, I mean normal. Israel has had a decades-old relationship with Egypt since 1979 and a decades-old peace treaty with Jordan since 1994. The Egyptians and Jordanians on the issue of normalization haven't even come close to what these agreements purport to promise. So I won't call it transformational. It might become transformational if other Arab states, particularly Saudi Arabia, join. Right now, it's a smart transaction in which American, Bahraini, Emirati, and Israeli interests seem to coincide.
And for those listeners who don't quite understand what full normalization means, give us one or two examples of how you would describe what was present in the relationships or lack of them before and what's available now.
We had a lot of informal contacts with the Emiratis and the Saudis and the Bahrainis. You actually had Israeli private sector representatives showing up in Manama, capital of Bahrain. And for years, you've had informal cooperation between the Emirates and Israel. What this promises, symbolized by a direct flight from Israel's Ben Gurion Airport to Abu Dhabi, bearing the Israeli delegation and an American delegation. This promises the kinds of normal relations that normal human beings like you and I would expect and demand, as if we were somehow negotiating peaceful, normal relations with the Canadians. There are going to be embassies. I'm sure the Emiratis or the Bahrainis won't put their embassy in Jerusalem, probably in Tel Aviv, given the sensitivity of the matter, and there'll be an Israeli embassy in Manama, Dubai, or Abu Dhabi. So, again, if of course these materialize and everybody signs up and fulfills their commitments, it marks a significant change. The other thing it does, I believe, it breaks apart a traditional Arab state consensus enshrined in the peace initiative that there will be no peace with the Israelis, certainly not this, unless the Palestinian issue is on the road to resolution or formally resolved.
Let's talk about that, because as you mentioned, it was thought in many policy circles that, there would be no such normalization absent a recognition of Palestine or without, at least the blessing of the Palestinians. But they've really been sidelined by this process. Where does this leave them?
I think it leaves them with very few options. An honest man or woman, if asked what they should do right now, I don't think could come up with a compelling answer. The options are pretty bleak. Armed struggle, returning to terror and violence. Both intifadas have demonstrated a bankruptcy, which has only made the situation worse. A lot of people encourage the Palestinians to negotiate, and I would say I would encourage them to put out their plan and to try to sell it diplomatically. But that plan, which is basically a two-state solution with East Jerusalem as a capital on borders that roughly approximate the June 1967 borders with territorial swaps of equal size and value, that is simply not acceptable to this Israeli government. It is not acceptable to the current administration in Washington. And I suspect even should Joe Biden be president, that would be an extremely difficult set of parameters to actually negotiate. The other options are forget two states. I mean, if you're not going to negotiate, you, Israel, aren't going to negotiate with us seriously on two states, then what we are going to do is we'll wait. We'll allow the forces of demography and history to take over, and we'll demand one man, one woman, one vote. We want to become Israeli citizens in one state, one binational state, or actually not even a binational state, one state in which Israelis and Palestinians live happily ever after. I think that's a dubious proposition at best. I think it was Ben Franklin who said that proximity, and that's the real issue between Israelis and Palestinians. Their lives are inextricably linked together, as are their futures. Ben Franklin said that proximity breeds contempt, and he added children. So the reality is that one-state solution is not a solution. It might be a historical outcome decades, generations from now, but it's really not an option. So I think, frankly, that right now they don't have any good options. There is a unity agreement, which was apparently signed between Fatah and Hamas, the two major factions within the Palestinian National Movement. But we've seen unity agreements come and go over the course of the last decade, and not much has transpired. So, I mean, Lauren, if you ask me, what is the best option for Palestinians at this point, I don't think I could give you a compelling one. I could say, articulate your peace plan, send your representatives throughout the world, and make them aware of the fact that you want to negotiate. These are the terms. You understand that in negotiation, there's always flexibility, and challenge the government of Israel and the United States to come to the table on terms that would meet the needs and requirements of both sides. But they're not even doing that. And I think it's I've never seen in the decades I've followed this issue a Palestinian national movement that was more demoralized, more dysfunctional, more divided, without options.
Aaron, you wrote a piece in the Washington Post saying that much of the American foreign policy establishment, including yourself, missed the signs of this peace deal. And in some cases, didn't even think a deal was possible, as we've just discussed. How did the Trump administration pull this off?
It's a fascinating question. I think it was a confluence, frankly, of three sorts of trends that came together. First of all is the regional reality that over the course of the last decade, key Arab states, particularly in the Gulf, have fundamentally begun to alter their priorities. Fear and threat of a rising Iran, which from the standpoint of the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Bahrainis is all too real a threat, combined with a fear of the transnational jihadi movements, Al-Qaeda, the ISIS derivatives, combined with a growing frustration and exhaustion with a Palestinian cause that just seemed to be interminable and never ending.
It's in they lost patience in some way?
I think they lost patience. I think they, in view of the Arab Spring, I think they began to understand those that weren't directly threatened, and the Bahrainis were, the Saudis less so, not the Emiratis, began to understand that they had to follow their own interests. Mm-hmm. I think over the course of the last decade, the canaries in the coal mine here were very clear. In 2014, the Israelis went to war with Hamas. There were almost 2,000 Palestinians killed. Large majority were Hamas fighters. But a significant number, and the numbers vary, anywhere from 700 to 1,000, were Palestinian civilians. Mm-hmm. Silence in the Arab world was deafening. Fast forward to May 2017, the fall of 2017 and 2018, when the Trump administration first declared Jerusalem the capital of the state of Israel, then pledged to open an embassy there, then opened an embassy. Had that happened a decade ago, you would have seen a degree of unrest in the Arab world that would have been severe. And yet we saw almost no reaction. The Turks, the Qataris, the Iranians, it's not a very strong and powerful counter-alliance. So that was the third, that was the third element. The second factor was the Trump administration itself. I met with Mr. Kushner 4 or 5 times in 2017 and 2018. And it was unmistakably clear to me that this administration was far more focused on what I might call, in theory, the 22-state solution rather than the 2-state solution. He made it clear to me that he and his father-in-law wanted to establish strategic relations with the Saudis and the Emiratis. And for the next several years, they went about it with a terrifying willfulness in terms of unlimited arms sales, unlimited support for a disastrous humanitarian tragedy, largely caused by a combination of Saudi and Emirati airstrikes and the cruelty of the Houthis.
In Yemen.
And finally, giving Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, a pass on his repression at home. And the embodiment of it, of course, was the murder and dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi. All of that combined to send a powerful signal to these 2 states that this was an autocrat-friendly administration, that if they wanted to pick up points in Washington to get arms sales, to get a freedom maneuver in the region, one of the best ways to do it, in addition to flattering the administration, and remember, unlike any of his predecessors, Donald Trump's first foreign trip abroad was not to Canada, not to Great Britain, not to Mexico. It was to Saudi Arabia.
Right.
So I think all of that combined to create a confluence of interests. And with respect to the Emiratis, the fact that the administration was willing to sell them, delivery might not occur for another half a dozen years, the F-35 Lightnings, which is far more than an airplane. It's a system which has extraordinary potential, both as a defensive and offensive weapon. That, I think, was the key. And the wink and nod by Mr. Netanyahu that somehow he would not raise objections to this sale without consulting his security establishment or the Israeli Defense Forces, all of that combined, I think, to produce what you saw in August and then the signing ceremony.
And speaking of Netanyahu, he's been on this political roller coaster in recent months. He was first unable to form a government, twice actually. He ended up forming a unity government with Benny Gantz after the third election was held. Then they had to handle COVID. But then he emerged with these secret deals. What do you think these accords mean for his near-term legacy?
Well, it's fascinating because the Israeli press, the pundits, the experts who follow Mr. Netanyahu and his politics on a day-to-day basis somehow believe that these deals, against the challenges that most Israelis are now facing, almost 1 million unemployed, a resurgence of COVID, which as of last week had Israel within the top 10, and at one point within the top 1 of newly reported cases in the world after masterfully handling the initial outbreak. Mr. Netanyahu, in order to appease the Orthodox communities, just opened up, and Israel had a surge. I think most Israelis, and the polls bear this out, really are not that enamored, and it is not going to help Mr. Netanyahu with his right-wing base, because remember what he supposedly traded for the Emirati normalization, and that was suspension, to use his word. But if you believe the reports that are coming out of the White House, at least 4 years of not addressing the question of annexing any part of the West Bank. So I don't think this will help him politically. I do think it adds to his image, whether you like him or not, whether you agree with his policies or not. He is emerging as a terribly effective Israeli prime minister. And the fact that he's got 2 Arab states that have just declared peace with Israel and full normalization, and we haven't seen one of those since Yitzhak Rabin and King Hussein signed the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty in 1994 in the Arava Valley. It's quite an accomplishment, and it will be part of his legacy.
We'll be right back to talk about the regional shifts. I would like to zoom out a bit and talk about the regional implications of the Abraham Accords. Last week, we heard rumors that a third country was going to announce a deal with Israel, which was widely speculated to be Sudan. We haven't heard any announcement at this point. What dynamics are in play there?
I think that it's just not a question of if there'll be additional Arab states who want to sign up and join the party, but really when. I think a case can be made that the next in line will be either the Omanis or the Sudanese. The Sudan business is all tied up in internal Sudanese politics, in large part because moving toward Israel is one of the vehicles that the remnants of Omar Bashir's regime is using in order to boost their stock and their standing with the United States. And second, you've got unsettled claims for the attacks on the embassies in East Africa as a consequence of Sudan's willingness to host Osama bin Laden, and survivors of 9/11 who do not want to give Sudan sovereign immunity, which would allow them to escape any lawsuits for aiding and abetting terror. So I think Sudan may take a while. Oman is in the middle of a leadership change. Sultan Qaboos has died. He's transferred power, or his cousin has acceded to power, Haytham. That may take a little longer, but Oman and Israel have had under-the-table relations and even out in the open relations. Both Netanyahu and the late Prime Minister Rabin have paid formal visits, quite highly orchestrated visit to Muscat in Oman. Then there are a number of tiny countries. The Palestinians were claiming not more than a week ago that the Comoros Island, the Union of the Comoros, Mauritania, were considering, and they are members of the Arab League, which is why it's relevant. They were considering. But I think, in my own judgment, this remains right now, without the traction of other Arab states joining, a transactional arrangement, not a transformational one. What would transform this, of course, would be a move by Saudi Arabia, the author of the Arab Peace Initiative, custodian of the two holiest sites to Islam, the country that exports the hardest line version of Islam, Wahhabi unitary Islam. If the Saudis were to normalize, and you can see on paper how Mohammed bin Salman, who will chair the G20 in November virtually, might look at this as a road to his partial redemption in Washington for covering up, with the help of the Trump administration, the murder and dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi. He, at the moment, however, is constrained by his father, King Salman, who is a much more traditional Arab ruler and very wary of taking this step. Religious clergy and a number of others in the kingdom who would use this issue, who I suspect don't like MBS, don't want to see him ascend to the throne. I would think that's virtually inevitable, however. Should Salman die or abdicate, I can see that MBS might be inclined to move toward a degree of normalization with Israel, perhaps incremental in the beginning, but clearly designed, because I think he wants to do it.
But he doesn't have the consolidated power at this point to fight those other internal factions, as you were mentioning.
Exactly. And if the wheels should turn in Washington, if Joe Biden becomes the president, then several things are going to happen which are going to constrain America's relations with the Gulf states. There's no doubt there'll be some kind of effort at some point to restore a dialogue with the Iranians to see what Washington can do about re-engaging on some sort of nuclear agreement, what the Biden administration calls a longer and stronger version. And Mr. Biden has already repeatedly castigated Mohammed bin Salman for the war in Yemen and for his human rights abuses. So I don't think the payoff for normalizing Israel under a Biden administration is going to be nearly, as glorious as MBS may believe it would be should Trump win another term.
Let's talk a little bit more about Tehran, since you just raised it. How concerned are they watching these shifts, and do they see some kind of Israeli-Arab coalition forming against their regional ambitions?
I mean, I think they understand that this is a highly consequential development. Remember, you're going to have Israel now, and you probably have had the Israelis there before, but now in a formal sense, you're going to have the Israelis literally knocking on their door a few short nautical miles across the Gulf, which will mean Israeli diplomatic representation in Bahrain and in the Emirates, but it'll also mean a heavy Israeli intelligence presence, which you probably already have. That's number one. Number two, I think that one of the reasons MBZ, we really haven't talked about him, Mohammed bin Zayed, was actually quite unusual. He was the missing party at the signing ceremony. I often wondered, why that was. If this is a peace and normalization agreement, why isn't the heir to the throne in Abu Dhabi and to the Emirates generally? Why did he skip the ceremony? Probably, I think he believes he got everything he needed, and didn't want to put himself in the position of actually having to be part of this. What he knows, was a Trump partly Trump campaign orchestrated event. And MBZ is concerned about what he perceives to be, and it started with the Obama administration, a sort of retrenchment of American involvement in the region. And I think he looks to the Israelis not as a military partner. I think that's a bridge too far. But look, the Israelis have perfected, initially with our help as well, short-range defense systems, Iron Dome, against cruise missiles and drones. And you remember, I think it was a year ago, Iranian missiles attacked 2 Saudi oil installations, taking 5% of the world's production offline for 2 weeks. That's got to bother the Emiratis. At the same time, they know they're vulnerable. There are 3,000 Iranian businesses operating in that country. Dubai would probably shut down in the face of a sustained confrontation.
So you're saying he's hedging, in other words?
Yes, I think he's hedging. He also is a man of firsts. First Arab state to launch a space vehicle. He's now involved in Libya as well. And he's running a competition with the Turks, who are a part of the F-35 program, although I think it's partially suspended because of Erdogan's behavior. But he sees himself as a rising force in the Gulf, and I think it's pure speculation now that he wants to separate himself from the reckless and ruthless policies of Mohammed bin Salman. He may well want to be now America's most favored Arab state in the region.
We'll be right back to talk about the Middle East in U.S. foreign policy. You have decades of experience negotiating and watching these types of deals. Looking at these accords strictly through the lens of U.S. foreign policy, put them in perspective. What are the longer-term implications of these agreements?
I mean, I think they're certainly not as consequential as removing 2 Arab states and Israel from active confrontation with one another. The 1979 peace treaty with with Egypt fundamentally transformed the confrontation line. It made it virtually impossible for there to be a 2-front war between the Arab border states and Israel. It essentially reoriented Egypt's foreign policy from Moscow to Washington. And under the guise of an extraordinary statesman until his murder in 1981, it created an image in the United States of an Arab statesman of heroic proportion. Jordan had been negotiating with Israelis, the king's grandfather, even before the state was created. And the formal peace treaty, which followed the Oslo Accords, basically turned the longest and arguably least defensible border between the 2 countries into one of the quietest. The paradox here is, even though these peace treaties, and they are formal treaties of peace, they're not simply declarations as the 3 sets of agreements the Abraham Accords are. But the paradox is that because the Emirates and Bahrain, and frankly, whoever else signs up, Sudan, Oman, the Saudis, are not frontline states. The flexibility that they have, the absence of truly constraining public opinions, which exist both in Egypt and in Jordan, will likely result in relations that are, assuming everything goes well, as expected, will end up with something that you and I could actually describe as normal, peaceful relations. Egypt does not have normal, peaceful relations with Israel. Jordan does not have normal, peaceful relations with Israel. It's somewhere between that and the absence of war. But after COVID, after the post-pandemic reality, I can see, since Dubai is such an extraordinary place to visit, I can see all kinds of tourism and travel. And the other interesting reality, and people should note it, unlike the other 2 peace treaties, these accords use language like they're called the Abraham Accords. It assumes a common ancestor. They talk about cultural affinity and tolerance and coexistence. I mean, it's really quite remarkable. And if the Saudis should come along with their hardline views of Israel, some of the worst anti-Semitic, anti-American, and anti-Israeli propaganda have emanated from the Gulf and from Saudi for so long. If all of that changes, then you really begin to see pretty fundamental changes in the regimes that these states represent. Not so much in the publics, that will take time, but it still would be a real transformation if the regimes committed themselves to all of this.
So unlike the previous ones, in some ways it's lesser because it's not removing the threat of war, as you said, but in some ways a greater impact because it's long-term cultural change and, that degree of normalization that you just discussed. It's an interesting way to think about it.
Right. And let's not forget the economic piece of this.
Right.
The Israelis are already estimating that we're talking $1 billion in trade alone with the Emirates.
Yeah. And those busy airports, as you mentioned. So we talked a little bit about this, but let's draw out what happens in sort of each scenario in the U.S. elections in November. If Trump wins, do you think Saudi Arabia is next in the near term, or what would be the next step? What would you expect?
I mean, I still think that the Saudi position and posture on normalization will depend on internal factors. If those should be cleared, if Salman abdicates or passes from the scene, and MBS, who could be king of Saudi Arabia for 50 years, he's 33, 34, 35 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Never had a Saudi king that young, that risk ready, and that ruthless as well, and reckless. But I still think it'll be governed largely by internal constraints and what the Saudis think they are giving up. And that's the other problem. I mean, they may present the Israelis with an offer. Normalization, fine. Transformative. Look what we're doing. But you need to do stuff for us.
Mm-hmm.
You need to deal with a reality. You have to make it easier for us by dealing with the Palestinian issue. And if Mr. Netanyahu is still prime minister, the evidentiary portion of his trial begins in December or January, where he's going to have to appear 2-3 times a week to confront before several judges, breach of trust and bribery and fraud.
Right.
If he's
so in the near term, obviously tough, but they would have 4 years.
Right. I think that the Trump administration would add this to its list of firsts and be willing to do just about anything for the Saudis. Congress, of course, is an issue here. I mean, if the Democrats should regain control of the Senate and the House and Trump retain control of the presidency, I think they would run into very stormy waters in terms of selling the Saudis additional advanced military equipment or countenancing the Yemen campaign, which still continues at the expense of a lot of civilians being killed. But MBS's decision, Saudi Arabia's decision to normalize with Israel, I mean, it might offset part of that unhappiness and opposition.
And if Vice President Biden wins in November, you've suggested earlier in this conversation that things might just sort of pause as people reconsider potential options. But what do you think the Biden administration itself would do? Would it pursue similar agreements?
Yes, absolutely. It's very hard for any administration to basically, unlike Trump policy on the Iran Accords, it'd be very hard for any administration not to build upon the desire of key Arab states for reasons that have nothing to do with the Palestinians to continue to reach out with Israel. I do think, however, that the Biden administration would make it easier for a lot of those Arab states by re-engaging on the Palestinian issue. And there are some low-hanging things that they could actually do that would boost these regimes' confidence that the administration was back on track. They'd endorse a two-state solution, They would probably reopen the PLO office here in Washington. They'd start a serious dialogue with Mahmoud Abbas and other Palestinians. They might even try, although I think we're sort of ignoring the reality that Joe Biden, should he win, is going to face a galactic challenge of national recovery not seen since Franklin Roosevelt in the 40s. I mean, at least 4 crises.
So he'll have other things on his to-do list, in other words.
And it's hard to imagine, without a lot of buy-in from the Israelis and the Palestinians, Biden administration really investing a lot of political capital in this, unless the so-called parties were willing to do so as well.
You've already mentioned Jamal Khashoggi, and this week actually is the 2nd anniversary of his murder. The consolidation of power by MBS we've talked about, but continuing this thread of if Vice President Biden wins the election, how do you think he'll approach Saudi Arabia and this increasingly emboldened crown prince?
You're not going to get the, here's $200, you can now pass go. There'll be no get out of jail free cards. I think he'll up the effort to re-inject into American foreign policy generally, but definitely with respect to Saudi Arabia, values and ethics and human rights. And if there's a Democratic Congress, which is going to have to buy off on arms sales, there'll be no emergency authorization under a Biden administration. Weapons the Saudis clearly don't need. I think you're going to get a reframing of this sort of extraordinary, I wouldn't even call it a special relationship with Saudi Arabia now under the Trump administration. It's an exclusive relationship with Saudi Arabia. We've essentially given the Saudis everything they've wanted, and we've asked for almost nothing in return. So I think that will be reframed, and I think a reset or a balancing of that relationship. Because look, episodically, we share some interests with Saudi Arabia. On the value side, we share no interests with Saudi Arabia. And we have to re-inject reciprocity into this relationship. It's frankly, Jamal Khashoggi was a friend of mine. It's an embarrassment and a travesty that this administration has behaved the way it has. And October 2nd, next week, 2 years later, there is still no accountability and still no accounting with respect to that. And I don't expect the Saudis to fess up, but I do not expect the United States of America to continue to adopt the positions that it has in this matter.
I would agree with that. Last question, big question though. Really from the end of the Cold War, the Middle East has been among the dominant areas of focus for the United States, our energy, our resources. I, as a young diplomat, came of age when, 9/11, the Iraq War were really, cornerstones of how the U.S., the lens through which Americans saw foreign policy. Looking forward to the next decade of American foreign policy, how should any White House view U.S. interests in the Middle East?
25 years in government, working under both Republican and Democratic administrations and voting for Democrats and Republicans too. One of the things we never do is clinically and coldly identify what our core national interests are. What is vital as opposed to what is discretionary? And in the Middle East, we got sidetracked into thinking that somehow we held the key, not just to security, but to political reform and prosperity. I mean, the Middle East is literally with the remains of great powers who believe wrongly that they can impose their will. I mean, I don't want to sound patronizing here, but on small tribes, on small countries who are a lot more willful, a lot more willing to do things that we shouldn't be doing and aren't willing to do. And I think, what's happened here in the last 6 months has created, in my judgment, a new sort of a paradigm shift. I mean, we're now in the greatest threat to public health since the great influenza of 1917, 1918. You've got an economic recession and uncertainty, structural uncertainties in the economy that even the economists aren't sure how we're going to deal with them. You have racial, political, and class differences more defined than I've seen them since the 1960s. and you have a loss of confidence, crisis of confidence in the way Americans look at their institutions. I really believe we don't have the luxury any longer, certainly not of trillion-dollar social science experiments in Iraq and Afghanistan. We've got to distinguish between vital and discretionary. And if you ask me, we have three vital interests. I know it's cold and I know it's clinical, but we've made too many mistakes not at least to come to terms with them. Number one, we need to prevent another catastrophic attack on the homeland. Number two, we need to guarantee, even though we're freeing ourselves from Arab hydrocarbons, the free flow of oil, because the world needs it. And without it, you end up with financial crises and havoc that will affect the United States. And finally, we need to prevent the emergence of a regional hegemon with a nuclear weapon. Those three things, American presidents have already demonstrated that they're willing to put Americans in harm's way for. They're willing to spend resources, and they're willing to spend American credibility. So I'm not arguing the human rights, the Palestinian issue, trying to figure out a way to get at least help these parties get good enough governance. If you can't get, I won't even use the word democratic practice, but I think we need to be prudent and careful, because we don't have the luxury anymore, even though we got non-predatory neighbors to our north and south and fish to our east and west. These liquid assets, these oceans, basically give us a degree of detachment and security that no other nation on earth has. But it also leads to an elusive notion that somehow we have this margin for error that is virtually inexhaustible, and we make mistakes. And I don't think we can afford any more in this region. So what I'm suggesting to you is a balance between transforming this region, which we cannot do on one hand, and extricating ourselves from this region, which we cannot do. We've got to find and identify the middle ground that makes most sense, first and foremost for our interests, but also in a way that we can be constructive in doing as much leading multilaterally and even unilaterally as we can afford.
We'll leave it there for today, but we'll look forward to having you on in the future and talk more about what's next, maybe after the election. Thanks so much, Aaron.
Thank you, Laura.
Till next time. Thank you for listening to The World Unpacked, produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We're grateful for your listen and eager for your feedback. We welcome your emails at podcasts@ceip.org. And please rate and review us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find me, Laura Lucas Magnuson, on Twitter @Laura L. Magnuson. These discussions are only made possible by our wonderful team behind the pod. Our audio engineer is Tim Martin, and our executive producer is Maya Krishna Rogers. We'll see you next time.